This is the sixth video in the series on applied genetics, and the topic of this video is why are we different? In other words, where does variation come from? And we have talked about the fact previously in this class that variation is a very important component of life. If we didn't have it, what we would see is life would break down very quickly. So we've already talked about two sources of variation. So let's go back. The ones we've talked about already are independent assortment, which is where the chromosomes randomly divide between the gametes. Let's just review, write that out for review. Chromosomes divide randomly. And the second one is crossing over. And these both occur during meiosis. So we remember when they lined up as a tetrad in the middle, the way that the homologous pairs lined up was completely random. And also when they're in that spot, they're going to crisscross their ends and they're going to swap their genes. So this means that the chromosomes that your mom and dad pass along aren't identical. First of all, aren't identical to their chromosomes, and second of all, they're random. You don't get the same, set, in between from gamete to gamete. It varies. So what we want to do is we want to look at the new sources of variation. Number 3 is something called a mutation. A mutation is a random change in the genetic code. Random change in the genetic code. And this can be one of 3 things. This can be good, it can be bad, or it can be neutral. Good, bad, or neutral. And this kind of depends on your environment, on the severity of the mutation, and what it affects. So we've talked about one mutation already. We talked about sickle cell anemia, and we said that's where the gene for the red blood cell protein has a change in one allele. Now, if you live in Africa, that's a good mutation because it helps prevent you from dying from malaria. You live in North America, that's a bad mutation. There's nothing there that's beneficial for it, and it causes some health effects. So again, whether that mutation is good or bad really kind of depends on your environment. If we wanted to look at a population of organisms, we would find that there's other sources of variation, such as the way that animals, organisms mate. Is that random? But that deals more with population. So here we're looking more at individuals. And what we want to say is, if we take all of these together, so these are all of our variation comes from these sources. That if you take all of these variations or changes, they are then acted upon by something called natural selection. And natural selection kind of ties back to what I said about a mutation or a change being good or bad, depending on where it's at. So this is where the change, I guess you could say it interacts with the organism's surrounding. The organism's surroundings and this in turn determines if it's beneficial, if it's good or bad. So example 1, this mutation occurred in Africa, and in the African setting, it was good. And so we saw more of this gene. The organisms that had this gene had a better chance of survival. So what happened was they tended to pass it along. If this had occurred in North America and there's no benefit, now it's a bad change. The organisms don't have an advantage for survival, tends not to get passed along. Another example is moths. This is the one that's always used. Most of the moths in Europe were white because tree trunks were white. Well, there's a mutation that popped up that gave the moths a black color. And at the time that was bad because the black moths would show up against the white tree trunks. They had a disadvantage because they would be eaten. But as they started to burn coal in England, the tree trunks blackened from soot. And all of a sudden that bad mutation became good because now the moths were camouflaged. And so they had an advantage. And so the moths that had the black mutation survived. So we call that natural selection leads to what we call reproductive advantage. Reproductive advantage or disadvantage. Sometimes reproductive advantage is called survival of the fittest. Survival of the fittest. Because the one that has the best advantage is the one that survives. Nothing has exhibited this as much as COVID-19. So what happened was we started off with the alpha variant and it made us pretty sick. And we did quarantine because we didn't have a vaccine, but you know, it wasn't horrible. Then we had a Delta that came along a little bit later, and Delta, by that time, the virus had mutated. And it had mutated in such a way that for the virus, it was good, but for us, it was bad because what happened was the virus could attach to our cells stronger and it caused us to get sicker. So the reason it was good for the virus was because we would produce more viruses inside of our body and spread it, but it was bad for us because more people died. So the virus had a reproductive advantage due to this mutation. And we look at this circle between mutation and reproduction, mutation and reproduction as natural selection. Don't confuse this with evolution. So evolution is something different. When we have natural selection and it happens over, so we have natural selection over the course of a long time. That's evolution. And this is where we get the big changes. This is how giraffes go from being more like a zebra to a giraffe, or how they believe whales used to be on land, how whales go from being a land animal to being an ocean animal. And this evolution is the accumulation of a lot of small, so we get a lot of small changes here. Usually this, back to red, usually this is small changes versus evolution, that's a lot of small changes added up. So this is the sum of thousands of small changes. Sum of thousands of small changes. But remember the starting point. These are our points of, oh, by the way, let me add something here. I can see I forgot something. This is in eukaryotes. Remember, we talked about the fact that we did conjugation in prokaryotes. That's where the bacteria swap their genetic information. So back to my point, we talk about this change. So all of this in this bubble, all of this in this circle is a change in a species. Change in a species. But that all starts with these sources of variation. If we didn't have this variation, we wouldn't see species change, and we wouldn't be able to adapt to our environment. We wouldn't get that reproductive advantage, which is really beneficial in terms of species. So what we're seeing now is, another example is, we're seeing a lot of natural selection at play due to global warming. So especially in corals. Right now, the corals are dying because the ocean water is warmer and it's harder for them to form the structures. You know, they form these reefs. It's harder for them to form reefs. The calcium tends to dissolve. So what's happening is the corals that have that are better able to tolerate the warmer water are the ones that are surviving. They have the reproductive advantage. There was a mutation that lets them adapt and live in warmer water better. The ones that need colder water are dying off. And so what we'll see is we'll see the corals change over time. The problem is we're changing our environment too quickly. This is a slower process for us. We're changing our environment too quickly for this to catch up with global warming. And so it's pushing a lot of species close to extinction because they don't have time to allow this change to take place. So it's a good motivation for us to be a little more careful with our planet. All right, so what are our takeaways? We've talked about two sources of change before this chapter, and in the next video, we're going to talk more about mutations. Mutations aren't necessarily bad. They can be good. Sometimes they're neutral. And all of these changes cause natural selection to happen. This is when the environment will push a mutation or a change to being good or bad. Call that survival of the fittest, is reproductive advantage. And when natural selection takes place over hundreds to thousands of years, that's evolution. Okay, let's talk about mutations next. Thanks for watching.